Hey, hello everybody, and wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another edition of Table Talk. And uh, for those of you coming in here for the first time, Table Talk is a show about food, uh, but it's not a cooking show. People may talk about cooking as we go along in these shows, and they may refer to specific recipes or anything like that, but it's not that kind of a show. I am not qualified to do that kind of show. What I like to do is find out what people think about food, because I find that food intersects with practically everything. And the Simple Recipes group, which this series of talks was born from, uh, demonstrated that to me in a big way on how food, connected with politics, with gender, with caste, with so many other things. And one of the topics that's been on my mind for a fairly long time, something that I think about as someone who is a carnivore, eats meat, but not as much as I used to. Maybe once a week, maybe once in 2 weeks, that kind of thing. And I cut my meat consumption for a couple of reasons. One was general health as one gets older. And two, you start learning about the way that meat comes to our tables and the processes and the things that are involved there. And even if you can make that mental shift that does not associate food with a living animal, there is still a whole lot of issues along the way, including animal cruelty, but also about sustainability, about how can this planet provide that meat for us without us reaching a state of environmental collapse. So a few years ago, a friend of mine sent me some material about the Good Food Institute India. And I was pretty fascinated when I started looking at that. And I knew a little bit about it. Like many of us, we would have heard of the Impossible Burger and a few things around that broad area. But I really didn't know how much was happening about this all over the world. And I went over and met Varun, and we had a chat, and Varun and his team gave me some stuff to read. And since then, I've been following this. And at one point, I thought I'd do a story about this, but not being a working journalist anymore, this is the way I do those stories now over this. So Varun, welcome to the show. Varun is the head of the Good Food Institute in India and Asia, and someone who's focused on this broad area, someone who's taught me a lot just by following him and seeing what he talks about. And we haven't talked since that time we first met. So it's a pleasure to be able to chat again, Varun, and welcome to the show. So
yeah, thank you so much for having me. You can hear me, right? Everything is all good here?
Everything is all good. And thank you for making the time to be at this show, because I know that you have a huge number of demands on your time. And this is a Sunday, and it's, family time and weekend and all that. And so all the more grateful for you for you having made the time to come. So, but welcome to Table Talk. And Table Talk is informal. It's, we sip our tea or coffee or water. Friends who have come in on the show have brought their food along with them. All of that is fine. And well, I thought we just start off by just getting to know you a bit better and to get to know you through your food. And perhaps if you could think back to your first experiences, your first memories of food and how it was prepared.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I have to keep making sure that I'm not on mute. But firstly, yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for having me. This is a fun way to spend a Sunday evening or night, a late evening. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation. In terms of formative memories or early memories of food, I'm looking at the audience here, everyone is Indian, right? Probably from India. We all have these kind of melting pot style memories of food or formative experiences with food, where you might have parents who are from different parts of the country. And as we all know, this country is wonderfully diverse, right? Which is a huge strength, and a very interesting and beautiful thing about this country is that every 200 kilometers, there's some different sub cuisine, and yeah, it's really interesting dialects and cuisines and general cultural differences. So my mom is Konkani from Mangalore. My dad is Marathi from a place called Dharwad, which is now Karnataka. So that's been the kind of formative cuisine or the early cuisines that I tried, at least growing up. And I'm 31, so I'm not that old, but a significant change has taken place over the last 10 years, as we all know, with more and more internationalization and more packaged foods and more, variety in how we're eating. But when I was growing up, when we were cooking at home, it was influenced by traditional cuisines, right? So I ate a lot of coconut infused stuff, a lot. I mean, I grew up non-vegetarian. I've been non-vegetarian most of my life. So we would eat kind of what we'd call like ghati chicken, which was like coconut gravies with chicken, and like all kinds of really delicious Mangalorean dishes that had coconut as a major influence, like something that held it all together. But then, of course, as kids, I have an elder sister. So as kids, my mom would pack us lunches, which were all kinds of different things. So like puri bhaji and theplas and all kinds of random stuff as well. So like that kind of melting pot influence is what I mean. And of course, we all know, especially if you live in Bombay, that has been particularly diverse for a very long time, even relative to the other Indian metropolises, right, which are now more and more diverse. So yeah, it's been an interesting upbringing. And to be very honest with you, food, like I'm not the kind of person that lives to eat. Um, I've never been that kind of person, or I wasn't that kind of kid. I wasn't a I don't really think I had very strong tastes for anything specific. So my mother used to always say that that was the one thing that I did not trouble her on, was food and food choices and just eating whatever was put in front of me. And my sister was a very picky eater and continues to be. So she was a bit of a drama queen on food. Like we used to have to do, not we, obviously she's older than, she's elder to me, so I didn't do any of this. But my parents used to have to do stuff like really silly stuff. So if she was unwell and she had to eat dahi chawal, right, dahi bhat, they would put, you know what gems are? They're like Smarties. Everyone knows what gems are. Cadbury's gems. They would like put gems in her like dahi bhat to make her eat the dahi bhat when she was like sick. It was silly, really silly stuff like that. So that was the one thing that I did not give my parents trouble with, was food, and everything else was a bit different. But food was something that I was very non-picky on, not really very strong taste anyway.
And do you cook?
I do. Yes, I do.
When
And
did
it's
you
most,
start cooking?
yeah, I mean, it's mostly like it's at this point, there's so many and there's a couple of, there's at least one plant-based meat entrepreneur here in the audience today. And I've recently been, Somesh recently been cooking up some of the stuff that you've sent as well. So a lot, as you can imagine, a lot of what I'm cooking now is like plant-based meats and plant-based, eggs and all kinds of different samples from the entrepreneurs that we work with, and stuff that's already on the market, and just tracking the market essentially. But for myself also, I do enjoy cooking. I really enjoy like the concept of bowls, like one dish meals, like because of the convenience and like just throwing a bunch of nutritious stuff in there. So I'll make like oats with tempeh and spinach and like a bunch of really healthy stuff in there, right? Like carrots and all of that stuff. I will make breakfast smoothie bowls, fruits, veggies, like that kind of stuff I really like. And I do track my nutrition. So I track like my macronutrient intake and whatever. You can get decently accurate with that if you're like used to tracking it. So I do track that. So that's kind of my focus.
Okay. And but your cooking, where did you pick up your cooking? Was it mom teaching you, or was it like when you grew up and went to university and stuff like that?
No, it was mostly university. The stuff that I cook, my mom is usually like commenting on my Instagram stories saying, "When are you going to cook this for me?" Because I've never tried the stuff that you cook.
Mm.
And they live 10 minutes away in that direction, so it's not that far. I could cook for them, but we've always had cooks at home, right? And I think most in the audience will have experienced that as well. So it's not, my mom was not in the kitchen like cooking up the stuff herself. My mom was also a young professional who moved from Delhi to Mumbai for work, and then she got married, and then she had kids in short order and stuff like that. So she wasn't doing a lot of the cooking herself. And so most of what I learned like from the internet, because I'm very much equally a child of the internet, I would say.
Okay. So you tell us a little bit about growing up and your journey to university and early work life, a bit of that, if you could just go over that.
Yeah, of course. So look, I grew up in Mumbai. My dad is a cancer surgeon. So I've been kind of obsessed with healthcare for a long time in my life. And initially, that was the kind of delivery of healthcare. Then beyond that, it became about kind of the business of healthcare and health tech, which, as we know, is a very interesting, exploding space. And there's a lot you can do with technology in healthcare. And then from there, I got involved as I moved to the US to study chemical and biomedical engineering at college at Carnegie Mellon University. And I got involved in a bunch of other random stuff in the healthcare space. So I never ended up finishing my degree. So, when I say I moved to study, it's a pretty generous definition of study. It's a loose definition of study, to be honest with you. But I got involved in a bunch of random stuff, entrepreneurial projects, like fellowships at a foundation. And I learned a lot about what the biggest problems in global health are, right? So the ideas of how we can evaluate what the biggest problems in health are globally, and you can guess at what those are, right? Like there's a bunch of diseases, right? Malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, etc. And then there's also just like the delivery of healthcare and the governance of healthcare and technology and all of that stuff. So that space is called global health, right? Or international, just like it is the intersection of philanthropy and health, right? And through that exploration, once you start evaluating those questions, I got pretty interested in the idea of what are the most important problems we can focus on, not just health, in the world today. And I got involved with a community of people that does that kind of analysis. And that's how I came upon this problem of meat or factory farming.
All right. So how to get into a bit more detail about that?
Yeah. So I'm going to jump directly to the factory farming stuff here, right? So when you start evaluating some of the, and by the way, I'm wearing the t-shirt of the, so this, I don't know if you can see it, it says effective altruism, which basically is just like applying the questions of, just applying a little more rigor to what are the world's most pressing problems and how can we solve them, right? Most optimally solve them. When you start thinking about these questions, a few things come up over and over. Global health being some stuff there, global poverty, right? There's still so many extremely poor people in India. And then one major problem that comes up as a central node in a lot of the things we all already care about, right? We all care about climate change, we care about public health, we care about food security, undernutrition, pandemics, all of this stuff, right? One thing that comes up over and over as a central node to or a cause of all of these things is the way that we currently get our meat, eggs, and dairy, which is through this large scale industrial factory farming system. So we rear all these animals, right? Billions upon billions, right? 70 billion land animals and about 3 trillion with a T fish every year. And the fish are not all reared, obviously, they're wildcat also. We have to use a huge amount of resources and do a lot of damage to our planet to get all of that done, right? So just to give you an indication of how this stuff works, a chicken is the most efficient animal that we farm for meat on land, right? It is incredibly inefficient as a protein production platform. A chicken takes in about 9 calories, nearly 9 calories of input in the form of wheat, corn, soy, basically chicken feed, to give you 1 calorie of output in the form of flesh, right? And that's the most efficient animal. So if you look at cows and pigs, they're much worse than that. If you look at fish, depending on the fish, they're worse than that, right? And so in order to rear all of these animals, and even now we're farming fish and all of that stuff, we have to use huge amounts of resources. We have to use 9 times as much land for chickens, 9 times as much water, grow all those crops, feed the chickens, transport the chickens, emit the greenhouse gases. So chickens emit something like 60 times more carbon dioxide per calorie of protein than lentils, right? And it's not just, climate change is the major thing that people are talking about right now in this dimension, and rightly so, because anything that we care about under climate change, so all of the stuff I just mentioned, right? land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation linked to all of this land use, right? So we're chopping down the Amazon to clear space to grow crops like soy, to feed them to cattle and then eat cattle, right? Which is, or feed them to chickens and then eat chickens, which is crazy. So anything that we care about under the bucket of climate change, so deforestation, species loss, ocean dead zones, ocean acidification, greenhouse gas emissions, all of the things we all care about, this is one of the top 2 or 3 biggest causes in the world across all industries of all of those things, right? But it's not just climate change. It's also things like public health, pandemics, etc. Because to rear all of those animals, we have to keep them well. We have to grow them in close proximity to each other. And so we actually feed them a bunch of things like antibiotics to make sure that diseases don't break out, right? So something like 70%, maybe up to 80% of all antibiotics in the world are given to farm animals and not to humans, which I think we all know this. If you go to the doctor and you tell them you're taking an antibiotic, they will say, finish the dose, right? Even if you feel better, finish the dose, right? Or don't take an antibiotic unless you need it. Because what's known as subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics, it breeds disease, it breeds resistance to those antibiotics, right? So we've actually created this breeding ground for superbugs in this whole sphere, right? So in fact, the former head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Margaret Chan, said that this system of feeding antibiotics and using them indiscriminately is basically leading us to a world where common infections will once again kill, right? Which could be the end of modern medicine as we know it, because it's extremely expensive now and nearly impossible to make new antibiotics. And by the way, diseases still happen anyway, right? Like even though we're using all these antibiotics, diseases still happen anyway. So I think we all know about, not belaboring the point here, but we all know about things like avian flu and African swine fever. All these outbreaks happen anyway. So these kind of twin threats of antimicrobial resistance, which is huge, and zoonotic diseases, which is diseases that jump from animals to humans and have been most of the pandemics that we've seen. Even if we disregard COVID-19 and say we don't know what caused COVID-19, maybe it wasn't the wet market or the seafood market, and it wasn't that, maybe it was something geopolitically motivated or whatever. I'm not going to speculate on all of that. But all the other ones, 75% of the other ones, right? Like swine flu, MRSA, SARS, all of that came from animals, right? So things we need to think about. Yeah, so look, these are the major issues that we face as a result of the food that we eat. And these are, things that we can talk about. We could have this conversation all night, but this isn't the way to convince people, right? You're not going to be able to tell people, hey, the chicken that you're eating is escalating the risk of antimicrobial resistance, and it's going to make our drugs stop working 10 years from now. So please stop eating chicken, only eat chickpeas or chana, not chicken, or eat broccoli, not beef. That's not going to work, obviously, right? So the idea here is what is the theory of change? How do we get people to stop eating this stuff and eating other things instead? And that's kind of the question that we're looking to work on. How do we feed all of these people, 10 billion people by the year 2050, 1/6 of whom will still be in India, without continuing to break the planet?
Right. Step back a bit and get to your journey to GFI, to Good Food Institute. And how did you your early career wasn't in this area, right? How did you land up in the Good Food Institute?
Yeah, my early career, so to speak, given that I dropped out of college, I worked on a number of healthcare things, right? So I did some interesting fellowships in the healthcare space in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where I was for college. And it was a pretty gray area. Like everyone else in these fellowships were like training to be doctors, and I was like this college dropout who was doing stuff, right? But we did interesting things. We were evaluating questions like, by the way, this was around the time that Obamacare was coming into effect. So it's a very fascinating time for anyone who cares about health systems or like studies this stuff, because what they were trying to do was trying to make people more accountable, health providers more accountable for keeping patients well. And it's not as if a nurse in a hospital is saying, I don't care about this patient. It's just that they're too busy, right? They've never had to think about those things. And so patients, let's say the problems that we worked on were things like homeless patients who have a bunch of other issues. They might have chronic diseases or substance abuse issues, mental health issues, etc., because they're homeless. Obviously, those things coincide with each other a lot. they bounce from emergency room visit to emergency room visit, which is quite tragic, right? Like that should not be happening. We should be keeping people well in between hospital visits. So we try to do things like embed technology in that process, at least keep their records intact so that you don't have like someone come in and you don't know who they are and you give them some drug that interacts badly with something else they're taking or whatever, right? Stuff like that happens all the time. I regret to inform you that we did not solve those problems, but it was a lot of fun. I really learned a lot through that process, and around that time is when I got involved in this whole effective altruism community that evaluates these questions of what are the biggest problems in this area, right? So evaluating global health, then jumping from that to climate change, jumping from that to other things. And I moved back to India intending to work in the healthcare space and explore more of these ideas. I actually joined my father's hospital and did some technology implementation stuff. And in kind of exploring this community of effective altruism, I came across the Good Food Institute, and I came across them at some conference. The founder of the US GFI, Bruce Friedrich, was speaking at this conference, and when he was speaking, the this whole space, at least for me and many of the people that care about it, the idea of alternative proteins, kind of the theory of change hits you like one of those things where you say, wait, hang on, this is so obvious in hindsight. This makes complete sense. Why don't we just do this? Right? So what he was talking about was, look, I, Bruce Friedrich, have been in the animal welfare movement, and we've been telling people to eat less, like not eat animals for a long time because of suffering or whatever, right? Because animals are living creatures or whatever. People in the climate change space, and he has jumped from animal welfare to climate change and other things too. And in the climate change space have been saying for decades that we need to have a different diet for a growing world. We can't afford to eat more and more meat as time goes by. Incomes are going to continue rising. Places like sub-Saharan Africa eventually will have huge meat requirements, right? And that's not vilifying sub-Saharan Africa. What I mean is incomes and populations will rise all over the world, right? And so just as with energy use or electricity use, etc., meat in particular is an aspirational good, even more so than those other things, right? And so, and it's deeply entrenched culturally and all of those things. So people will demand more and more meat as time goes by. By the year 2050, we'll need to produce 50, 70% more meat just because of rising incomes, etc. And that's disproportionately rising, even more than our population is rising in that time frame, because there'll be more prosperity in that time frame. So instead of telling people, as I was saying earlier, instead of telling people to eat chickpeas, not chicken, or like, confrontational groups like PETA going and throwing blood on people, which, they're doing their thing, whatever. Why don't we just give people an option that literally tastes the same or better and costs the same or less, right? So that's the theory of change. It's as simple as that. We need to make foods in other ways that perfectly emulate the taste of meat. And we need to make sure that it's available at a cost that everyone can afford and available everywhere. So put differently, the theory of change is taste, price, convenience. It's as simple as that, right? And when you hear this idea, it's like, hang on, that makes complete sense. That's just economics, right? Like, let the consumer make a choice. You don't have to mandate them to eat this instead of meat, but give them an alternative that tastes the same or better and costs the same or less. And if we can get there theoretically during our lifetimes, then we could solve this problem during our lifetimes. And so I spent some time with the team and I looked at like the cost curves and all of the stuff that you would look at, right? Like some of these things are pretty technology forward. So just as if you were looking at renewables or electric vehicles 20 years ago, you would have questions about like, hang on, is this something I should work on? Like, is it even a solvable problem in my lifetime? Um, and if it's not, then let me work on something else that is high impact and solvable, right? Like you need to have the mix of those two things. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels. In electric vehicles, literally spinning your wheels. But here, it seemed like we could actually achieve what we set out to do during our lifetime. So it made complete sense. So GFI is a global network of organizations. There's GFI US, Israel, Brazil, Europe, India, Singapore. We're setting up all over Asia now. And that's been very interesting to look at expanding across Asia. But at the time, we didn't have any of this stuff. We had, we set up GFI India. And for the first year, it was just me. So I was managing director of myself, which was a lot of fun, actually.
Always nice. Always nice. Yeah. Uh, what are all the things that GFI does?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's also a large question because we basically do everything it takes that we think is necessary and doable to build an industry from the ground up. So we work across business, science, and policy to build the entire field of alternative protein. So as we call it in India, smart protein, right? So that means, let me start with business or the industry side of things. We work with entrepreneurs to literally get their companies started from scratch, help them understand how these products are developed, what the technologies are out there, what kinds of people they should be hiring, and we like work with them to even like write JDs and put them out, like job descriptions and put them out. We have a strong network of young professionals and people now that we can connect to each other and get hired. We work with investors, help them find a thesis, understand what the space is, how to invest in it, etc. We work with large corporations, the largest food, agri, biotech supply chain companies that can help to build out the space and launch their own products. We'll work even across the distribution landscape, right? So, um, you know, supply chain and distribution. So manufacturing companies, agri supply chain, distribution, meaning like QSRs, like fast food restaurants. We like brief all of them. We brief retail. We brief like e-commerce platforms like Amazon, Big Basket, Swiggy, etc. And we essentially build out the entire industry. And that means, at least initially, we've had to handhold a ton of, I should say, we've had the privilege of handholding through the entire journey from beginning to end, a lot of entrepreneurs who are now launching products in the market, which is extremely satisfying, right? Now, moving from industry to science, this is a very new field. So that's really exciting, actually. There's a lot of improvement all the time. And a lot of that has to come from science, right? It has to come fundamentally from uh, basic improvements in taste and texture and price and all of those things, right? We have to get better on so many dimensions. And I'm sure we're going to talk about how these products taste and how we can get better. But we work with universities, um, we publish a lot of our own open access information. So we employ like PhD scientists at GFI India and the global GFI network who publish analyses of the space. We actually teach university level courses. So we've launched GFI in Singapore has launched university courses at National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University. In Israel, GFI Israel has launched courses at like 4 universities in Brazil, in the US, etc. We've done that. So that's really exciting, training the next generation of innovators, basically advancing the state of the science, etc. We also do have a global competitive grant program where all the GFI organizations come together to like accept applications and then like fund research that advances the space. And then finally, in policy, which intersects with all of these other things, of course, we work with government agencies, regulators, and we really think that these three dimensions, business, science, and policy, as you are seeing in a bunch of other areas. So you're seeing it in the government has just announced a recent semiconductor mission, right? We think all of these dimensions need to come together. Business, science, and policy need to come together and go mission mode on this, right? Because we're really talking about where we are right now, where renewable energy was 30 years ago, right?
Okay.
But we can't afford to wait 30 years for this to mature because the problems that we're facing now that this impacts, sustainability, pandemics, all of those things are very urgent. And we have to meet our promises under the Sustainable Development Goals, which are decade-long promises, and we're already 2 years into that decade. So yeah, we are doing a lot and really privileged to work with a nice ecosystem of people to push all of this forward.
It's fascinating. Yeah. I had not realized how much work was happening in this area till I first talked to you and the kind of stuff that you and your team shared with me. And there's so many things you've touched upon here, the aspirational value of meat. And that's so much like climate change as well, when people are saying that, okay, you guys who in more advanced economies, you're burnt your fossil fuels, you have a better life style and standard of living now.
Yeah.
And you don't want us to do that. So help us along, right? Give us a bit of a thing. Otherwise, we'll have to go through the same thing that you did, and we are far more populous.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. And there's so many related things out there. Cultures, caste comes in, oppression, comes into this as well. Religions come into this, and uh, perceptions of various kinds. I mean, you've lived abroad, and you would know that so many people think of India as a vegetarian country when it's actually not, as a majority. There are some pockets, parts of India which are very high vegetarian,
Yeah.
but more than 60, 70% of us do eat meat and use animal products. And so it's not just the food part as well, the byproducts of the industry and things that people don't think of as being vegetarian. I mean, milk, butter, dairy products, products that we use, leather, honey, all of these things are animal products in some sense of that word. But we're focusing on at this aspect of meat. And I think the whole thing of, I mean, for people who are vegetarian, they will feel no need for a meat, an alt meat of any kind.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not part of the way that they look at the world. They, I do know people who are vegetarian from choice or from religion or principle or whatever it is, who do worry about things like how much protein they're getting, what kind of the right kinds of protein, and what do you need to eat to be able to make sure that you have a balanced diet and all of that. So there's a bunch of stuff to unpack in different directions. But in this alt meat thing,
Yeah.
the layperson's, that is me, understanding of this is that there's these two broad areas. One being taking plant-based stuff and making it taste like meat, or taste, feel, and also give you the kind of benefits nutritionally that meat does. And there is the lab grown or cell based meat, where you're taking meat cells and growing them in a laboratory. And eventually you'll come to the state of being able to have something that is technically in every way meat, but has not resulted from the death of an animal.
Yeah.
Right? Is my understanding of that basic thing sort of there?
Yeah, it is. So you're right. So there's actually three big buckets. And there's the third one that's emerged that you haven't yet characterized is fermentation, which is using microorganisms. So
Yeah.
fungi, microalgae, even bacteria to produce proteins, or to you can grow fungi in very large quantities. And I don't mean button mushrooms, obviously, right? I mean uh, fungi that actually, when you grow them in large quantities, they actually have a significant amount of the bite and the taste and the texture of meat, and you can produce them in certain ways that retain that bite and taste and texture of meat, and they can be put into other categories of food like eggs, like fermentation derived proteins that can be turned into egg substitutes and dairy substitutes, etc. Yeah, you're right. There are these three big categories. There's plant-based foods, or let's call them plant-based proteins, right? So utilizing crop ingredients like soy, pea, um, you know, things like coconut oil or whatever, and producing plant-based meats, next generation foods that they are not our grandparents' soy chunks. They're not supposed to be. They're supposed to perfectly emulate and give you the sensory and the cultural resonance of meat, right? So they're supposed to taste, smell, sizzle exactly like a beef burger, for instance. That's where most of the efforts were concentrated early on for the last 10 years were on beef burgers, because like cows are the biggest emitters of greenhouse
Why
gases.
burgers particularly, by the way?
Oh, Americans eat 3 beef burgers a week on average, which is just crazy town, right? Like that's, it's a huge source of emissions. It's a huge source of, frankly, it's just not great for personal health either. But like, I wouldn't make the case based on personal health. I think people should eat what they want to eat. But it was a very important initial hero category that made sense to target. And of course, there's other hero categories in the US, things like pizza and sausages, etc. But burgers were the initial focal point because it just made complete sense. It is the hero category out of all types of foods in the US. So, for instance, the first wave of these plant-based meat companies globally, and they were founded in the years like 2008, 2009. Companies like you already referenced, Impossible Burger, made by a company called Impossible Foods, and then Beyond Burger, made by a company called Beyond Meat. If you take the Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods now have done a bunch of analyses of their like what's known as life cycle analyses, their sustainability impacts relative to what they are trying to offer an alternative to, which is the beef burger, right? So if you replaced one out of those three beef burgers for Americans with a Beyond Burger, right? So one out of three for every American, right? In aggregate, it would be the equivalent of taking 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million additional homes, because those are the gains that you can get. Like these products, because they're made from plants, utilize like 99% less land, 99% less water, emit like 90% less greenhouse gases and all of that stuff. So it was a no-brainer initial category to focus on, right? And you can get similar sustainability gains in the other categories, but now people are expanding into those areas. The second big bucket of all proteins that you mentioned is called what you call lab grown or cell based. We call it cultivated meat because it's like cultivating cells directly instead of farming and slaughtering the animal. So again, like you said, what you get at the end of this process, you're just cutting out the middle animal, you're taking the cells and you're producing the meat directly, right? So of course, that's a delicate process. It's a biotech process initially. It's not really scaled up into the mass market yet. But you're right that what you get at the end of it is biologically meat. So if you were allergic to shellfish and there was a cultivated, I don't know, mussels or whatever, right? Cultivated prawn in front of you, you couldn't eat it because it's biologically identical to prawn. Yeah, so that's kind of the second big category. And the third one is fermentation derived protein. So these are the big buckets. And the reason that we need all of them is because meat and eggs and dairy, animal sourced foods is like, a $7 trillion industry with a T, right? So we need all tools to offer alternatives. But it seems like we're on the right track. We're very much at the beginning of this journey, but at least with the plant-based foods that are out in the marketplace right now, they are getting a lot of hype, as you all know. I'm not talking about India specifically, I mean globally, especially in markets like Europe, the US, Australia, broader Asia. Companies that study this stuff all the time, JP Morgan and all of these UBS, etc. They're saying that only plant-based meats, just plant-based meats, not even counting eggs, dairy, not even counting the other categories, that'll be a $200 billion industry in the next 10-15 years, right? So these are things that are showing that they have huge potential to solve the problem that they're looking to solve, which is give people a viable option. Because chana instead of chicken or broccoli instead of beef has not been a viable option, right? People are just eating more and more meat, and that's causing damage to the planet and to themselves, because we all live on this planet.
Okay, I just realized that I devoured a lot of science fiction growing up, and as you said it, I remembered, damn it, yeah, I should have remembered the fungus part of it, or because I remember Asimov wrote about entire systems of what is it, mycoprotein and things like that, and a lot of stuff happening. Where would I mean, it's common in some cultures already, but insects, where would insects feature in this? What would that be? Is that an area that you are looking at, that Good Food Institute is looking at, and that you are looking at as well?
So yeah, look, firstly, I should say that at GFI, we are focused globally, GFI India, GFI Israel, wherever, we're focused globally on solving the problem. So if any of these categories turned out to be, some of them are earlier stage than others. So like cultivated meat, which is like, it still sounds like science fiction, right? You're growing meat from cells directly instead of raising and slaughtering animals, you're cultivating cells, right? If it turned out that that was not viable financially or in any way scientifically, let's say, we would stop supporting that, right? That's not like, we are not an interested party in any particular category. All of them appear promising to us right now. For a number of reasons, insects don't appear promising to us. The first being that there seems to be a higher disgust factor with insects than with even like growing meat from cells. And there is an ick factor with growing meat from cells too. But there seems to be a much higher a disgust factor with producing anything from insects. And that makes sense to me, right? I think in certain cultures around the world, obviously places like Southeast Asia, Northeast India, etc., insects are eaten. and things like cricket flour, etc. I think some companies will do well on stuff like that. But for the disgust and the consumer factor, that's one reason that we don't focus on that. And then secondly, also it does have some of the same issues in terms of inefficiency as an animal. So they are more efficient, insects are, than chickens, let's say, but they're not as efficient as plants, and they're not as efficient as fungi, etc. So it's, yeah, these are the reasons that we don't focus on insects currently, but we think that side of things is going to grow regardless of whether we support it or not.
With the cultured meat, the lab grown meat, what was the correct term? What is the term that you used? You said? I missed.
Everyone's converging on cultivated. So
Cultivated.
you could call, I mean, there's so many things you could call it, right? Like lab grown. Technically, lab grown doesn't work because everything starts in a lab and then it very quickly leaves the lab, right? So a more accurate term for it would be, at scale, would be produced in a clean, sterile manufacturing facility, kind of similar to how we currently manufacture insulin meat, which is just, it doesn't really roll off the tongue, right?
Yes.
And you can't really call it factory made meat either, because like animals are currently farmed in factory farms. So cultivated seems like the right thing. Cell-based, some companies wanted to use cell-based, but like everything is made of cells. Plants have cells, right? So it's a bit of a misnomer in that sense. Cultured as well is a bit confusing because we have like aquaculture, right? Like we have fish farms and seaweed farms and stuff like that. So in terms of creating clarity, as well as having like painting it the right way, like in terms of positive perception, cultivated seems to be what people are going with now, which is good. Right. But sorry, what was your question?
No, I was getting into, so how do I put this? You talked about like, what works and what are the trade-offs in these things. I was reading, and I'm unsure of this, which is why this is a question and not a statement, that with cultivated meat, the kind of inputs into it in terms of energy, in terms of what you're feeding the cells, all of these is pretty, not just expensive. We'll come to the expensive part later, but that places a large amount of demand on the planet. And similarly with plant-based stuff, that the kind of processing that goes on into it is a very high degree of processing as well. And these are what people like me from the outside who are not deeply immersed in this would be hearing. Are we hearing the right things? Are we not listening correctly? What's the scenario there?
So look, firstly, I think it's important to remember that it's critical to ask these questions, right? Which is why I was saying, if it turned out that any of these things are not promising on these dimensions, then we would drop it like a hot potato, and we'd move on to supporting the thing that makes sense, right? With cultivated meat, there has been increased scrutiny now that it's becoming more of a reality, right? It's currently one country in the world, Singapore, has actually allowed the sale of cultivated meat in the marketplace, which is really interesting. Honestly, the best way for me to show you the projected cultivated meat stuff is to just throw us one slide. I know this is not supposed to be slide heavy, but like just one slide. You'll have to enable screen sharing for me. But yeah, it's a good question. So let me just show you. The important thing to note here is that with these newer production processes, you can actually use renewable energy. So you don't actually have to use conventional energy, which places burdens on the environment. And companies in our space, the founders are in it for the planet, for the climate. So they've actually made commitments to using renewable energy, signed partnerships in that direction, etc. So hopefully we'll be able to get here. But here's I don't want to really focus on the numbers and all of that here, because this is a more informal conversation. But if you look at the 3 categories on the right there, these are all very, very ambitious benchmarks for conventional, that is just current animal-based chicken, pork, beef. So we're taking like the best scenario for those guys in terms of how they'll be able to reduce their emissions over the next decade. But if you look on the left there, cultivated meat, this is projected, and plant-based meat, they're just like vastly better on a number of different dimensions. So yeah, this is kind of where we are. And it's important to note that we're actually improving all the time in new industries like cultivated meat. I'm just going to stop this share because this kind of slide is a bit of a attention suck because it's got a bunch of numbers on the screen there. But the point is that, these are newer paradigms of producing meat that are not limited in the way that animals are limited. Everything I was describing to you earlier is actually a biological limit that we're bumping up against. We've been breeding these animals for decades, if not more, right? To get to where we are now, we can't actually get that much better. So you will hear, for instance, that, oh, there's this algae that you can feed cows that like reduces their emissions and stuff like that. It turns out it reduces their emissions by like 2%, right? You'll hear about low carbon beef. It turns out that low carbon beef reduces beef's emissions by up to 5 or 10%, and beef emits like 100 times more than soy, right? So like a 10% reduction on 100 times scale is like vanishingly small, right? So I think we can get incrementally better, but what we need in this decade is a paradigm shift. So all of these technologies or these categories represent a paradigm shift of what we can do, which is get orders of magnitude better. And that's kind of what we're going for here. So yeah, I think early signs are promising, even on the side of the biotech side where it's very early. The progress is quite rapid. The costs are coming down very rapidly. It's going to take a lot of work. None of what I'm describing is inevitable, but it's very promising thus far. To your other question about plant-based foods being processed, again, important that we ask these questions because these are things that we're putting inside our bodies, right? Just two things I would say there. The first is that the industry is definitely improving all the time, fast, right? You have executives from the likes of Nestle and Unilever and meat companies like Tyson Foods and Smithfield. All of these guys have invested in this space, which makes sense because they don't want to be disrupted, right? They want to participate in whatever's coming next. They all say, these executives who have like 40 years of experience, they say that this area of plant-based meat or alternative protein in general is the most fast evolving space. The products themselves are the most fast evolving that they've ever seen. What they're calling the iteration cycle of improving the products is faster and faster and faster than they've ever seen in any other food category. And these guys have been running like Nestle for 20 years, right? So that's really interesting. And that means a number of different things. The nutrition will increase over time, right? The processing will come down over time. The number of ingredients that you see on the label will come down over time. So this is still a very new, like, a 10, 12-year-old industry. And very rapidly now, a lot of things will change, I think, in this decade. And then the second thing is, I think processing itself is a bit of a something confusing, right? So for instance, everything is processed, right? Like and I have no problem with eating processed chicken or processed fish or whatever, but we just have to be cognizant that it is processed, right? So it's got the hormones and antibiotics issues that we've been talking about. It is generally, you just think about this process, right? Like we're growing crops, feeding it to an animal, breeding the animal continuously over decades. So the natural size of a chicken is not what it is now. So if you talk to the chicken producers, they'll tell you, oh, in 1990, we used to be at 1.4 kilograms per bird. Now we are at 2.3 kilograms per bird, but we need to get up to America's 3.4 kilograms per bird. That is selective breeding, right? And again, I'm not alleging that there's anything wrong with that. That's just how this stuff works, right? And then you're growing all the crops, you feed it to the chicken, you fatten up the chicken in like 44 days, you slaughter the chicken, also, and then there's a bunch of processing afterwards. And then the slaughter process itself is quite disgusting, right? So that's why you have all these outbreaks of diseases and all of that stuff. So I think generally everything is processed. We might as well eat the stuff that is processed, but happens to be like vastly better for the planet if it tastes good and if you can afford to buy it. And that's, I think, where we need to focus our attention, basically.
We'll come back to the cost bit because, I mean, I know that's another conversation. I mean, we had that briefly on Twitter when you responded to someone who had asked a question. But I want to, before that, ask you about what's happening in this world now. What are the products that are in market, close to market internationally and in India? We know, we will have, as I said, we would have all heard of Beyond and Impossible. And aside from these, what else is in the process of if not coming to Indian consumers. As you mentioned, some of the stuff there, if it's being imported, you're going to pay a high duty on it, then that knocks the prices up considerably higher. A friend of mine who did sample some of this and said that it's at gourmet burger level, and it compares favorably in taste. But we'll come to that in a different kind of, at some point, maybe in this discussion. But right now, where is the field now? How close are we to seeing things in market? What's already out there?
Yeah, so I'll start with global and I'll talk about, excuse me, one second. Yeah, hang on one second. Sorry, don't know what happened there, but I will start with global and then I'll come to India.
Yeah.
Globally, as I said, everything started with burgers in this kind of like next generation plant-based meat landscape. And by the way, plant-based dairy has existed for a long time, right? So just as an example, plant-based dairy in the US, plant-based milk accounts for 17% of the retail milk landscape. So in retail in the US, 17% of sales are plant-based milk sales, which is a lot. It's a huge number. That's because plant-based dairy has existed for like 40 years, right?
What are the different kinds of plant-based dairy that the US is consuming? Almond milk,
like,
I would think of.
Like liquid milk, yogurts, all kinds of like cheese, whatever dairy stuff that people eat, right?
Yeah, no, I'm saying what are the plant sources?
Oh, right. Okay. Almond milk, soy milk, oat milk has grown a lot in the last few years. You have companies like Oatly from Sweden, which is like a 30-year-old company that's become a bit of a cult, like smash success over the last few years. They are now public on the New York Stock Exchange, along with Beyond Meat being the two companies that are public in our space. That were startup companies that became public. And on the cheese side, it's usually like cashew and like a bunch of other stuff. Now there's like people doing cauliflower cheese, hemp seed cheeses, all kinds of interesting stuff, right?
All right.
And on the meat side, what's been happening is we're now transcending or going like beyond the burger to do a bunch of different other stuff, right? So you're seeing now chicken coming into play, plant-based seafood coming into play, but the meat space is still very early. So as I said, plant-based dairy is at 17% of retail sales of dairy. Plant-based meat is at like less than 2%, right? So even just to get there, it has to grow by like 8 times or whatever, right? Like close to between 8 and like, let's say 15 times if it's less than 2%, right? In India, and by the way, this is exploding all over the world, right? So there's Beyond and Impossible, and they are expanding all over the world. But there are also like regional startups that are now growing quite large. There's one called Omnipork in Asia. There's one called V2 Food out of Australia that's scaling all across Asia. They're doing quite well. A company called Starfield in China, in mainland China, just raised $100 million last week, or announced that they had raised $100 million last week. In India, we are seeing now, so we've been working on this for like 4 years, right? And we've got a number of different companies started. A couple of them predated our getting started also, but we got a number of different companies started and worked on branding, positioning, products, different kinds of things. And in India, the concept of going beyond the burger is even more important, right? So, I mean, burgers are fine. I think you and I would eat them, but like if we're going to get into like a true mass market situation, and even for you and I, variety is very important. India is not a one product market. You need like a lot of variety to satisfy people's needs. So
interrupt for a second here. Like you said, in the US, it's hugely important. I mean, the burger was the hero product because people ate so many of them. Yeah. Would it be possible to find that kind of a hero product in India?
Yeah. I mean, they are emerging, right? Like with companies like Swiggy and Zomato, you do see now a lot of data coming in on what is emerging as the hero products. Biryani seems to be one of the hero products. I would definitely argue that pizza, like Domino's, has been insanely successful in India, right? So like pizza is definitely doing really well. And we do find that, I mean, at least at the top end of the market, if you look at Swiggy today in Bombay, there's so many, and I'm sure in Bangalore, Delhi, Hyderabad, etc., there's so many now newer burger chains opening up. So like the Western QSR style format is definitely doing well in India, or at least like there's a lot of people investing in it in India, right? QSR being fast food, so burgers and pizza and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of them that are doing quite well. And there's a ton of pizza joints as well. But as far as India is concerned, we're talking about keema, kebabs, curries, biryanis. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff, right? So a lot of these companies that are out there are doing great work. There are companies like one is called Blue Tribe Foods, which has they have chicken nuggets, but they also have sausages. I mean, they have chicken nuggets and sausages, which are of course Western products, but they also have a chicken keema and a mutton keema, which is they're both pretty good. They actually did Blue Tribe Foods did an ad during the Cricket World Cup on Hotstar, which was kind of cool. The first plant-based company to do an ad during the Cricket World Cup, which is kind of a sign of maturity of the landscape or whatever. And then other companies like Good Dot makes a bunch of different products. There's a company by Ritesh and Janelia Deshmukh, the Bollywood actors, called Imagine Meats, which has driven a lot of attention to the space. There are, I'll see if Somesh in the audience wants to talk about his soon to launch company. But yeah, there's about what 2-3 dozen companies now that are in the space. There's one called Greenest Foods in Delhi, which also makes great food. So like, yeah, I think all of these companies are quite young. Everyone's going to grow. The products are going to improve. The cost is going to come down. They're going to scale across the country. But we made a promising start on the startup side, and then critically, the large companies ecosystem is also getting involved. The corporate ecosystem. So ITC is someone that we've worked with for like really years, but especially in a very focused way the last 7 or 8 months. And they've just announced that they're doing a burger and nugget, a plant-based burger and nugget. And ITC, of course, is an iconic brand that has huge distribution across the country, so and abroad actually. So we're doing a lot of work with them. They do intend to expand the range and to export from India to global as well. So they're not going to export burgers and nuggets from India to global. It's going to be Indian heritage dishes and then export that kind of brand globally, as they've done with a bunch of other things, right? So it's growing here. It's very, very early. And I think the proof is in the pudding. So until the companies actually put out products that, once again, taste the same or better and cost the same or less, these things are not going to scale across the country, because consumers deserve, if the ask is consider switching from something you know and love, the alternative should provide a viable experience, right? So something that is a comparable experience. That's kind of what we're talking about here.
I get it. Yeah. So, yes, there was a bit that I wanted to, that was in the corner of my mind and I kept it aside at that point. When it comes to more complex meats, the thing of getting the mouthfeel right has been one of the issues, if I recall right, in terms of the way that cells are structured. Easier to work with, say, some kind of seafood, the crustaceans and things like that I mean, you've had that, fake crab meat and all that kind of stuff happening in East Asia for a fairly long time now, reasonably good tasting stuff, and reproducing that, those meats seems to be a bit easier. Is my understanding of this right?
Yeah, so look, mince, so keemas and even burgers are actually ground meat that's formed into a burger, right?
Yeah.
So any kind of minced product is easier to do, and that should be intuitive to anyone, right? Essentially, you don't have to replicate the texture of like a full whole muscle cut, like a breast or a fillet or whatever. That's going to be much harder.
Steak, for instance.
Yeah, steak is for many people, steak, at least in the Western world, a steak might be the holy grail, right? Maybe in India we'll say a really fantastic chicken chunk, that, let's say, a chicken breast that can be cut up into chunks, that would be fantastic, right? So and mutton, of course, is very popular in India as well among people who eat meat, and I think will continue to get more and more popular as incomes rise in other socioeconomic strata as well.
You would get like the perfect run, for instance.
Exactly. So that could be the holy grail of what we're trying to accomplish in India. And those are harder to do. Like, you have to use processes with next generation equipment that is not widely available. So that's an infrastructure problem. And it again brings me back to like
that in layperson's terms, just sort of summarize that for people who might not have come across it.
That was it. That was my layperson term explanation, but I will try to re-explain it. But essentially, there's a process called extrusion, which is used in the food industry for everything. Like like a kurkure is an extruded snack.
Got it.
Pasta is extruded. Extrusion basically takes ingredients and puts them under heat and pressure to give you something in a certain shape or a certain form, right? So when we're trying to make a meat substitute, it basically is trying to take ingredients that are plant-based and turning them into like animal protein texture. And animal proteins are interlinked with each other. They are fibrous, which is why when you bite into a chicken or a chicken piece of chicken or you tear it apart, it has like that fibrous texture. So the equipment to do all of this is not really widely available around the world, but especially in a place like India. Extruders are not widely available, and I think that goes back to how can we come together as industry, government, etc., and say that look, this is kind of a generational opportunity for us to innovate in an area that the world is looking at, right? Create something that allows us to make in India, allows us to fulfill our rising protein needs without the negative impacts on the planet, etc., and build a new pillar of like a green economy, right? So you mentioned earlier that India is pushing back on the idea of transitioning to a net zero economy, etc., which I think is totally fair, right? So I think being put to the sword in terms of here's the targets you need to do, here's the emissions reduction you need to do, etc. I think that's fair, but I also think equally we need to take the onus of innovating on ourselves in countries like India, because a lot of the impacts that will be felt of failing to do so are local. Running out of water is a local impact. Really bad air quality is a local impact. Outbreaks of zoonotic disease are local impacts, right? I mean, again, I don't want to keep throwing statistics at people throughout the course of this conversation, but low and middle income countries, of which India is obviously a very prominent one, right? The one with the largest population. We have across all of these low and middle income countries, 41% of the world's population live in these countries. But we have across these countries 75% of the world's food-borne illness deaths, right? Like vastly disproportionate. And the point I'm trying to underline here is that we are most susceptible in countries like India. We are much more susceptible than the Western countries are to those same issues that are created by a rising demand for meat. Food safety issues, climate issues, etc. We are more vulnerable to them. So I think whether or not the West is saying, have targets for emissions reduction or whatever, we will need to innovate and get ourselves out of this, because most of the impacts will be locally felt and we can't afford those. I mean, it's really tragic. The people who feel them are the most vulnerable people among us, which is not the question you asked, but I got back on a soapbox. I'm sorry about that.
Soapboxes are fine. I mean, as I keep telling people who come for table talk sessions, digressions are a feature, not a bug. Because here we're having conversations. This is not a, Q&A with a set of things. We're just trying to understand more here, and I'm proxy for the audience in some ways. And we'll of course invite more questions on that. But yeah, so what all is happening now in India? You mentioned a couple of companies, but what are the broad areas in which work is happening? And of course, feel free to mention companies.
Yeah, so I mentioned a few, right? So companies like Blue Tribe Foods, Good Dot, Imagine Meats, Greenest Foods, these guys are out there in the market. They're scaling across the country as we speak. Companies like ITC are getting involved, right? So the big food ecosystem is getting involved. Investment firms have been set up purely to focus on this, / some of the other mainstream investors are looking at this. So you'll see the market, I think, really pick up, and this is like one of those sudden market activity, but actually 4 or 5 years in the making, right? In terms of how much work went into it or whatever. In terms of where we are along some of those other dimensions that I mentioned, that I think is, building out a supply chain, connecting to our agri supply, working with government to advance essentially the creation of a new industry. That's where we think a lot of the huge promise lies, in terms of, just building a new industry from the ground up actually means that we'll create a ton of jobs and economic activity. And the great thing is it's in a green direction, right? So these are green jobs. It's like, again, we need to build a renewable energy grid, or we need to do more in electric vehicles. And you'll be I mean, if just by osmosis, or if you read the papers, you will see every day there's so much news now about how we're going to advance electric vehicles now. Like Hero Honda's now manufacturing electric scooters at Mahindra's like factory or whatever I read yesterday. So I mean, there's a lot that's happening on that side of things, and we need to get there very fast. So there is stuff happening with government, with universities. We're going to be launching university courses at the likes of IITs and the food technology universities. I don't know if you would recognize the names. And yeah, we are super optimistic that we'll be able to kind of build something in India that is kind of unique, because the needs of the country and the opportunities in this country are unique, right? So, and I could go into that a little bit here. Like, let's say, agricultural biodiversity of India is unparalleled, or let's say um, it cannot be beaten anywhere in the world, right? We have these very diverse, we have a diverse topography, diverse agroclimatic zones is what they're called, right? We have this 8,100-kilometer coastline, like a really beautiful diversity of crops that we can grow in this country that are highly sustainable and happen to be things that can be used in an industry like this, in a fast growing sector like this. We've been obsessed with wheat and corn and sugar, not corn so much in India, but let's say wheat and sugarcane and rice for so long. And now the government is trying to say, grow pulses, grow millets. They've designated 2023 the International Year of the Millets, right? But you can't go to a farmer and say, switch from sugarcane or switch from rice to this other thing, unless there is a lucrative market into which that farmer can sell that produce, right? So an innovative, fast-growing industry can provide that lucrative end market to provide momentum to those new agricultural value chains. That's kind of what we're talking about here, right? So crops like pulses, millets, hemp, ongamia. I mean, like there's so much that we can talk about. Let's take mung bean. Mung bean has been grown on this subcontinent for 4,000 years. It happens to be the primary ingredient. Mung bean protein isolate is the primary ingredient in plant-based egg products all over the world. So there's a company called Eat Just, which makes the Just egg. Okay. And that company was founded in 2011, and they did a bunch of stuff before they settled on the Just egg as like their first like big push. Mm-hmm. That uses mung bean protein. All right. And if that company fulfills anywhere near their kind of projected targets over the next few years, they will be the largest private buyer of mung beans anywhere in the world. All right. They have sold the equivalent of 200 million eggs until now over the last few years, which is really cool. And they sell it in a liquid format, by the way. It's a bottled liquid egg. So you pour out how much ever you want. And that's a format that Americans are comfortable with, because you get these liquid egg whites and you get a bunch of stuff that you can just pour onto a pan and cook into an omelet or whatever. So, and it's a pretty good product. It tastes very close to an egg. I think they could use a little more of the masala that we put into our eggs, but that's fine. So, my argument here is we should be rewarding our farmers and rewarding our agricultural supply chain. So firstly, that company, Eat Just, should be sourcing all their mung beans from a country like India. They should be doing the basic processing of those mung beans in India so the farmers can realize even more value from it, rather than just taking the mung beans and exporting them elsewhere. And we need a groundswell of entrepreneurship to build this out further, right? So if I'm talking about 5 companies now, I should be talking about 500 tomorrow, so that this is a major pillar of agricultural value realization, right? And that's kind of what should be happening moving forward. Equally on the map. Sorry, let me pause there. I think you have a follow-up question.
No. I do have something that I think, but please carry on with that one. I will remember what I wanted to talk about.
Equally, we also have this thriving pharmaceutical or manufacturing industry that forms like fertile ground to build out these other industries, right? So for instance, I think everyone knows by now that we have the largest vaccine manufacturers anywhere in the world. The likes of Serum Institute of India, etc. We manufacture vaccines at very low cost for markets like North Africa and the rest of the world. Like the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation buy hundreds of millions of vaccines from the Serum Institute of India, etc. That actually forms fertile ground for the growth of industries like fermentation or cultivated meat or other things, right? So if we are saying that globally cultivated meat is going to be, McKinsey said $25 billion by 2030, right? India should be competing for that global supply chain, just as we've done in vaccines. So that's again going to create a lot of jobs, etc. And not to, not to forget that in terms of this entire thread of conversation was started because I said let's dive into what is unique and what can we capitalize on in India, right? We have this amazing young talented workforce which is forming the backbone of every damn industry in the world, including this one. Every company in the world that is, worth anything in our space has among its senior leadership, sometimes at the founder level and at the rank and file, a bunch of really great Indians, right? And that's true in every technology vertical. And this has been talked about, ad nauseum with like Google and Microsoft and everyone being run by Indians, right? So that's happening in our space too. And so I think we need to capitalize on that and build that entrepreneurship here locally, right, in our space as well. So look, lots of opportunities and a really exciting new space that has major promise to truly transform the way we eat for the better, so that we don't keep breaking this damn planet. That's basically what we're on to here, but a decade-long journey.
Mm-hmm. One thing that struck me there when you were talking about the eggs and the masalas is that the way the India's approach to food has always been in large swaths of the country has been a lot of spices, a lot of like say, unlike say a French cuisine, which wants the flavors of the ingredients to come out. Here we're about the flavors and the spices and the masalas and all of that. And that in fact would be something that would work well for the for entrepreneurs in this space, because say you'd be willing to sacrifice a little bit of say texture or mouthfeel and things like that, or because or, I mean, even on taste you don't have to work perhaps as hard because it's going to be spiced up, and most people's palates will not be able to make out fine kind of differences. That's one. But the thing I wanted to, I mean, that was just in passing, but and we can come back to this if in a bit if you'd like to pursue this. But what you were talking about cultivation, etc., what it occurred to me is that see, livestock provides incomes. uh, what happens to the people who are making their livings with livestock? What is this industry, this, and I'm sort of broadly calling it all an industry, even though it's so many disparate industries, so forgive me for that. But what is this broad industry, this space doing to tell these people, here is what you can do that will give you a living that's as good, if not better, than what you had before?
Yeah. So I think the picture is never as simple as, oh, this is going to replace a bunch of jobs, because firstly, this is going to be a
No,
phased.
obviously I'm being very simplistic about this, but
Yeah.
this is a concern that people in the business
No,
will
for
say,
sure,
yeah,
100%. And okay, let me start with, we are, 100% pro a just transition. If there is going to be a transition, it should be a just one, right? And that's a phrase that's been used a lot in renewable energy, and moving from coal to renewables, basically coal-fired plants that generate electricity to renewables that generate electricity. That's a phrase that's been used a lot, is just transitions. And by the way, as of 2020, 29% of global electricity generation was from renewables. So that transition is happening in that industry. Um, but anyway, so there will be a just transition. It needs to be that way. Everyone needs to be brought into the future of food, as everyone is being brought into the future of energy, etc. And everyone needs to have a stake in the future of food. Um, the idea here is that in the interim, we can actually create a lot of proofs of concept, which was your question about what's being done, right? So as an example, some of the stuff that we're working on is, let's say, people who already do shrimp aquaculture. And shrimp aquaculture is a huge industry in India. It's like one of our, I mean, alongside dairy, it's one of our big success stories in agriculture in India. And that's happened mainly over the last 10, 15 years. If they're already doing aquaculture for shrimp, which means that they have ponds in which they produce shrimp, can they also produce seaweed or microalgae in those ponds that can form ingredients for our space? So, increase their income, diversify their income in that way. Equally, if someone is producing crops for, let's say, cattle feed or whatever, right? Or even if they are in fact dairy farmers, can they on the side also grow other crops? Can they grow mung bean, which is a rotation crop, right? Can they use different practices that enable them to augment their incomes, right? So the question is never going to be as simplistic as, hey, replace this one thing with this other thing immediately. It's never going to be as simple as that. There's going to be a phased transition, but we have to ensure that it is a just transition. And then a last point that I want to make is that even for, so you are right, livestock do create income and they create resilience for these vulnerable communities in many ways. But the picture is not that rosy, right? If you're a smallholder farmer and there's an outbreak of avian flu, you have to cull, which means kill, like 4,000 chickens, and you're done. Like that's your. I mean, then the government, of course, will provide like some relief. That you'll have to take a cash handout, which is going to be a distressing process, right? Like you'll have to go through the rigmarole of that entire process. But in the meantime, you've suffered huge losses, right? And if you are a small farmer, chances are you are there's some level of subsistence to your farming also, so you might be hand to mouth, etc. So the interim period of seeking relief because you had to kill your entire stock of 4,000 chickens or whatever is going to be very stressful on you. So if we can think through more resilient sources of income for everyone, whether it's in our space or not, that would be ideal, right? Because nothing is perfect. And even with things like, let's say, aquaculture, shrimp farming, etc., there are disease outbreaks and there's antimicrobial resistance and all that stuff. And the fixes to this, the improved practices that can fix all of this in the way that they're currently doing it. So like, is usually stuff like buy very expensive equipment that they cannot afford anyways, right? What we are trying to do is not a rosy picture either. I'm not saying that we're going to come in and immediately every farmer will switch over and they will have the same guaranteed income, if not more, and it's going to be highly sustained and it's going to be, it's going to be a rosy picture for the next 10 years. We have to build that momentum on the end market side, and we have to build those linkages into the backward agri supply, or backward into the agri supply rather, so that there is this kind of just transition. So yeah, a lot of work, as I said. And we as I don't know if we're the best organization to spearhead that side of things, right? In terms of the agri integration, but we have a ton of partners who already work with farmers. So there's a great organization called Digital Green, which works with like 1 million, let's say 1 million farmers in Andhra Pradesh, many of whom are producing shrimp. So as I said, we're working on seeing if we can get some of those farmers to additionally grow seaweed and microalgae, etc., so they get diversified income. Right? So those are the kinds of things that we can do in partnership with others.
Okay. I'm going to take this question from Sabira Fernandez, who asks, and I'm going to adapt it slightly because it's something that I was going to ask in any case, about barriers, mental barriers. You mentioned, for instance, the ick factor on insects. For a lot of people, meat itself is ick factor. When it comes to cultivated meat, where does this stand? What are the kind of reactions that you are hearing from consumers about, is this like ethically, if I may use that word broadly, and I think you know what I mean, is it meat in the sense that we're used to thinking about meat? What kind of, especially in a country like India, where there is a lot attached to the meats that we eat and we don't, right? So what kind of, in the course of your conversations with these entrepreneurs, with their consumers, etc., what are the kind of reactions you're getting, particularly in this area, the cultivated meat? What are people saying?
Yeah, so look, I mean, cultivated meat is not available for sale in India, right? It's only available in Singapore right now, and then there's also some other people that have done tastings in other parts of the world, but those are not commercial sales; those are just tastings, right? So a lot of what we have to rely on right now is theoretical research, right? So ask people why they might consider consuming this, why they might not consider consuming it, and in that area, as recently as 2019, 2020, we've done comparative research between, let's say, India, China, and the US. We did a cross-country comparison, which is a published paper. Happy to send it to anyone. But essentially, India, for plant-based meat, India ranked pretty highly in terms of their, like, their willingness to try, willingness to buy regularly, willingness to pay a premium, etc. For cultivated meat, it was about 32% of the population said that they would be very willing or extremely willing to try or purchase it regularly rather, and the corresponding number for plant-based was double that. It was 63%, right? And I think that makes sense to me, right? It's so new. It sounds like so much like science fiction rather, that a minority of the population saying they would be extremely willing to buy it regularly if it lives up to its promise, it still makes sense to me, right? So I think that there have been other interesting studies that have been done. So in the Netherlands, for instance, there was a study that was super interesting, what's known as a choice experiment study that was done, where they had a small group of people, 59 people, I believe, and they offered every one of them 2 burgers, and they said one of them was a cultivated meat burger and one of them was a regular meat burger. In reality, both of them were regular meat burgers, but all 59 people chose to try the cultivated meat burger instead of the regular meat burger. Okay. Now this is the Netherlands, right? It's a different country. Culturally, it's different from India. India might have more, as you said, aspiration around meat or fear about technology in food or whatever, right? So I think it remains to be seen to some degree, the impact in terms of how consumers will perceive it. But to my mind, or to our mind, given, as I said earlier, the size of these industries in meat, seafood, etc., even if one of these categories, which is cultivated meat, is only for 10-20% of consumers, that's still totally fine. It still justifies the moonshot project of trying to make cultivated meat a reality in terms of how many emissions it would save and how much work it would do to offset or prevent rather a lot of bad consequences.
Mm-hmm. Is anyone working in India on beef, on substitutes for beef, whether cultivated or plant-based, considering that beef is a fraught word in this country?
Yeah, and I think, in some sense, some of that is settling down, right? Like, so, I mean, at least at the top end of the market, you can just buy, at least buff you can buy, right? And that there's no taboo associated with that right now in terms of buying buff and all of that stuff. So I could easily see why people might work on that. And technically, if you're eating an imported Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger, then that is the flavor profile is beef, right? That's the beef burger. But no one that we know of in India, which basically means no one, is working on beef right now. Even those people who are in, like, obviously they would be very early stage and it would still essentially be a science experiment. Those who are working on cultivated meat are working on poultry or mutton, etc. So as an example, and this goes back to your question of what's happened in India already, on the scientific side, we worked with the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, Hyderabad, and the National Research Center on Meat, Hyderabad. Whatever, these are 2 research universities, right? They are actually 10 minutes away from each other, and each of them did not know the other existed until we linked them up.
Right.
And this is really fascinating, right? You need meat science experts from the National Research Center on Meat, and you need cell culture experts from the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology to make a truly harmonious project. We co-wrote a research proposal in 2019, and we worked together to get it funded by the Department of Biotechnology in the government of India. And at the time, actually, it is a 4.6 crore research project working on cultivated sheep cells. So that would be cultivated mutton, which at the time was the only cultivated mutton project anywhere in the world. It was also the largest ever government grant up until that point for cultivated meat anywhere in the world, which is really cool. And of course, since then, Israel and Singapore and all these countries have blown us out of the water in terms of how much money they've dedicated, which is good. So there's an emerging space race for smart protein, which we really like, and we're going to keep stoking that space race. So yeah, I mean, people are working on mutton. Somesh, do you want to come in here and talk more about, get it from one of the entrepreneurs' mouths on what you're working towards rather?
Hi, Somesh. Welcome to the table.
Hey, hi Varun, hi Peter.
Hi.
How are you guys doing?
Doing
Thank you.
good.
Thank you for allowing me to the. Yeah,
Yep.
great, great. We're having a great conversation here.
Yeah. Tell us about your enterprise and what do you do, what you're doing, as much as you're willing to tell us. That is, considering that this is a public forum.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, so we are just about to launch our products, and probably in next 20 days time we will be rolling out our brand, which is by the name of Just Dig In. So the idea was to have a piece of a slice of life kind of a name which sticks around your dining table conversation. And so we me and my core team, we we have been into the industry, as Varun was saying, and we have me personally, I have worked in dairy and meat processing industry. One of our senior team member, Chirajit, again, he has been into the same space. So we have had done all of that, had seen the industry from close quarters, and we have been very very much looking to do something in this space where we can come up with a great alternative. And as Varun kept saying, there are a couple of things which we very very much focused on, which is taste, texture, and sensory, because we are also conscious carnivore. Majority of our lifetime we had been meat eaters. So now we have become a conscious carnivore, so to say, and we have understood the threats, the issues associated with it, and we have graduated. So largely our focus was always to have products which taste good and doesn't have any off taste, and the sensory also ticks the right boxes. So these are few things which we are focused on, and we have got a host of products, list of products, and the idea was to offer choice to consumers, as in the last conversation where you were saying that what is the hero product for India. So largely there's no playbook around, but maybe a butter masala, a tikka, these are the low hanging fruit where we should be focused at. Although finger food is the primary focus, because the early adoption is around finger food, where people can have as snacks and as starters. So these are the space where we are working on currently. And yeah, interestingly, we have got a product which is American style steak, which is almost the same like a beyond patty, which is almost of 100 grams. So it goes really well as a hamburger. So the idea was to offer to the very niche and very premium consumer, or eateries, or places where they do offer these products, so that we can have the right alternative there. So that's the kind of product and brand we are trying to build. Another 20-25 days at max, and we would be out in the market. Yeah.
Super. Varun was talking about, it's a keema kind of thing. Extruded meat is easier to do, a patty kind of thing. How are you solving the thing of getting something that feels like steak? You
That's
mentioned.
right. So the idea is, again, it's the texture is again ground meat only, where we are trying to put it in the shape and give it that size and texture. And it is ultimately, it will look like a grilled burger patty only. But again, it would be like a hamburger. Yeah.
So not
So
a
so the
steak.
general hamburger which we have around. Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So it's not a steak, because you mentioned that in the chat that it's a steak, because that's a
Yeah,
different thing.
right. So it's not a whole, it's not a whole muscle cut. Yeah,
All
right.
right. And what kind of reactions are you getting from, I mean, you're obviously testing as you go along and doing some consumer testing along the way. What kind of reactions are you getting? And also the thing that I touched on with when, what Varun and I were talking just before you came on, how are people reacting to it conceptually?
That's right. See, in our market survey and research, we met a lot of respondents where we saw that a lot of people are eager to make the switch, but as because there is not a right kind of alternative out there in the space, and the space is just really starting off, so they feel at times dished, if they don't get the right kind of alternative. So once they have the right kind of alternative, they will make the switch faster. And that's the whole point. We as a brand are trying to make people make the transition happen smoothly. where they don't feel cheated that or they feel left out on a dining table where if they're not having the right kind of product or a meat substitute, then they are left behind. So we are giving them an alternative which is almost there. So the acceptance rate is pretty high. More than 70-75% of people are willing to try, and out of that what we have seen is around 30% want to retain that, giving all the right kind of things associated with this product. For example, these products are it doesn't have any preservative, no cholesterol, zero trans fat. So these are few good things for consumers to kind of get hooked on to these kind of products.
All right. Okay. And I'm not quite sure I've understood your question, Sangeeta, in the chat. I'm going to enable your. I know you said you don't want to come on camera, but I'm going to allow you to talk. Turn on your microphone if you would like to ask your question. Sangeeta Khanna, this is for you. Sangeeta is a very influential person on Instagram, huge number of followers.
Hi Peter.
Yeah. Hi, Sangeeta.
Yeah.
To ask your question, please.
Hi, Varun. We've had a little bit of interaction in Delhi IIC. Once I asked question from the audience, and I'm sure you won't remember. But my questions are like alternative mates coming from animals like insects. You all were talking about. Why not utilizing some pests like pigeons and rats? Rats have been conventional food for some communities in India as well, and they're nutritious, and they're not cultivated, they're not farmed, right? And they're in large numbers in many places in India. Why not that? Is that being looked upon in India?
So certainly not by us. I think it suffers from the same issues in terms of just like disgust around eating them. And I think if you marketed a product like rat meat or pigeon meat, I think that people would vastly, based on everything that I've seen, they would vastly prefer chicken or mutton over that, to the extent that I don't think it would be a viable category at all. That's my feeling on it. Exotic meats tend to be even higher prestige, right? So things like, I don't know, things like kangaroo meat or like all kinds of really interesting seafood, etc.
Yeah, I do understand, but some countries have made disgusting kind of animal-based foods as tourist traps as well. There are examples, right?
Yeah, no, of course.
But everything that people eat at some point, there are things that people will eat in one part of the world, which people in other parts of the world will find completely alien. Okay, there are cultures that would consume, say, dog meat, which would be unthinkable to many other people here. And I'm sorry, my friend Abod is in the audience, and Abod is the guy who's the founder and the engine behind Welfare of Stray Dogs. And I'm sorry about being insensitive on that thing, but things like eating monkey or what we talked about earlier, insects. Most things are right at some point in the world, and the ick or the disgust, etc., is also problematic in the sense that there is a certain, why, if it's okay for them, why can you not cater to those people? There are the things there as well about where it is. We talked about aspiration. For many people who lack privilege for whatever reason, because they're an oppressed caste or low income or whatever it is, this is what is accessible. All right. You can eat, there are parts of an animal that will be consumed by people very low in say the caste or the economic hierarchy, which people in higher levels would not touch for a variety of reasons. But here's where it gets used, So with all of these things, so is it because of these things are lower in the aspiration chain, or is it because they're not enough of a market for them? And this is to both of you, Varun and Somesh, as an entrepreneur and someone who's got this big picture of the ecosystem, Varun.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think you're exactly right. I think Pratibha's put a similar point in the chat. Yeah, I mean, millennia ago, we domesticated certain species, and some of them became friends, some of them became food. In some, like you said, in some cultures, so in some instances, some of them are friends and food, like dogs, etc., depending on the culture, right? Um, I think we are where we are now, and on a time scale of within 1 decade, it's going to be very difficult to convince people to eat, like at a large scale, to eat insects or rats or pigeons, etc. If we're talking about like decades or centuries, which we don't have to solve this problem, that would, I think, be fine, because you can affect a large scale generational cultural shift or inception of some kind, where you convince people that it's not disgusting to eat something. But it is what it is. I think, I don't think in this decade we're going to be able to do that. In fact, I said earlier that the insect side of things will grow. There's one called Yinsect, YNSECT, a very large company that's raised $150 million, that's based in France, that's going to create this like massive manufacturing facility for insects. Um, Most of their trade or their sales are going to come from taking those insects and turning them into animal feed, not selling them into human populations, because they're not like, that occasion of eating insects for humans is just not large enough. And of course, some places have turned it into a tourist attraction, but I would go there and eat it once and then like never do it again. That's the problem, right? So like as a daily habit, a really large food category, and like actually competing with chicken and mutton and beef and things that people eat, pork, which is the largest eaten meat in the world by value. Um, yeah, it just doesn't seem to be, unfortunately, the case that we can do some of these things.
Sumesh, as an entrepreneur, you chose to focus in this area of the lamb and the beef substitutes. Uh, why did you zero in there, and you know the kind of categories that we just talked about, which may be niche, whatever it is, but what was the process by which you came down to saying, okay, this is what will we do from the universe of things possible?
Right. So largely, Peter, we are focusing on chicken and mutton products. Beef as just one of the product we have in the kitty, in the bouquet, so that we can offer diversity to our client. Whether it is food service or whether it is end consumers. But largely, the focus is on chicken and on mutton, because largely, if you see, India is more into chicken consumption, and if we can get the right kind of substitute, then that's the larger category to cater to. And in our all our research and talking to consumers and insights, we found out that that is something as a product where people are very used to, and early adoption will happen faster. So that's the reason why we are focusing on chicken, mutton, and just as a specialty product we have the American style steak here. Yeah, the hamburger, basically.
All right. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take this question from Krishnan Venkateswaran, who says, is there a case to be made for the government to replace the existing egg-based diet with a synthetic meat substitute, thereby reducing the need for cereals and rice in the diet to get to a nutritional goal? The egg in meals has become contentious in some parts of the country. The midday meal scheme has been amazing for getting kids into school. It was, for many communities, it is the only good meal that kid has, a solid, nutritious meal, and it's an incentive to get kids into school. But what is being served becomes divisive. The egg has become divisive. So what do you think something like this would go there? And broadly, this also is the next thing that I did want to talk about as well, which is alliances, and in terms of also people like Sangeeta, who's an influential person on Instagram on nutrition and food. People like my past guest, Manu Chandra, who is a tastemaker in so many ways. I mean, being a very influential chef, or my guest next week, who is has a couple of Michelin stars, and so on and so forth. What kind of stuff are you doing in that broad relation? But let's start with this bit. Midday meals for kids. What could we give the kids now that would be less contentious than that egg, and help us to meet those nutritional goals?
Yeah, And the government in India actually doesn't dictate what people eat, except in certain small instances, right? And of course, they have influence. But the midday meals program, the ICDS program, and the midday meals program are great examples of how the government can influence very directly what people eat. And unfortunately, there have been protests against eggs in places like Madhya Pradesh, etc. The reason the egg is in there is because it's a powerhouse of nutrition, right? So an egg has not just the macronutrient content of protein and fat, that's great, but it also has micronutrients like choline, etc., which people argue are fantastic. And there's a scientific basis for arguing this. They are fantastic for child development and nutrition in general, and staving off the very tragic undernutrition that plagues our population. And when I say plagues, this isn't hyperbole. It genuinely plagues our population and impacts our ability to shape our own destiny as a country, right? So we have a significant portion of the world's undernourished, especially among children, that is vastly out of proportion with our population. It's much higher relative to our population. So I'm with you on the need to replace, or the opportunity to replace, eggs with other stuff. But I do think that when we're talking about things like midday meals, there should be a burden of matching nutrition, etc. So we've talked to a few entrepreneurs about this, and there is, I think, interest from the entrepreneurial side. I think our industry needs to scale and grow up a little bit before we can be on that scale of supplying to the midday meals program. But there's definite interest. I think it would make sense to do, just like have much more nutrient dense foods that are tasty, etc., that make a lot of sense. By the way, one of the underlying reasons to do what we're doing is, once again, telling people what to eat, mandating they stop eating something else, etc., just doesn't work. It's not right from a justice angle either. And but on the other side of it, on the flip side, you do have to make something sexy to introduce it into people's diet. So let's say, for instance, people were not eating that much protein before. You have to provide them with something sexy that they actually want to eat, right? So that's why a lot of the efforts to introduce protein into undernourished populations' diets actually just focus on making much better for you versions of things that people already eat. So things like fortified atta, which is fortified with like B vitamins and all kinds of other different things, is a much easier sell than trying to get people to take a vitamin B pill, right? It's just much easier to do that. Or like a kurkure type snack, which has a kurkure type snack which has like protein added into it, is a much easier sell than like trying to get people to drink protein shakes, right? Even if you made them widely available, etc. So yeah, I think making things sexy is an important dimension of all of this, which is why it's fun to work with entrepreneurs like Somesh to think through the branding and how to embed into people's lives.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, making the sell, as you know, when I was talking about reaching out to people who are tastemakers, literally. What kind of work is happening in that area? What kind of outreach is happening to people like Sumesh is a manufacturer, and so this is to you as well, Sumesh. To restaurants, home convenience foods is one aspect of it, but to people who write about food, who blog about food, photograph food, who rate and value food, or tell people about interesting things, what's happening in that world? How are you folks going about influencing the influencers, if you like?
Somesh,
Yeah,
do you want
sure.
to go ahead?
Definitely. Yeah. Sure, Peter. That's one of the trends, which we as manufacturers or promoters also, which we have to look at. How we can influence these influencers to try these products, write about them, rate them, and make it more convenient for early adopters. And people, those who follow them, and they just look at their content. So if we can get all of that onto the mainstream, then definitely we'll find a lot of adoption happening, a lot of people trying the products, who they are, maybe they're hesitant to try them firsthand. But if an influencer is writing about it, or putting a post or something, definitely it drives sales. So yeah, going ahead, that is one of the BTL and the influence activity which we also look forward to doing, and that's going to add a lot of value. Absolutely.
Yeah, and like Somesh's company, which again the brand is called Just Begin, which is launching within the next 2 weeks, or in the next 2 to 3 weeks, 15 days, he said.
Yes.
And Somesh, you are initially launching in the city of
Right.
East
Delhi NCR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you want to talk a little bit more about your launch plan and stuff?
यार बॉम्बे है ना, नवी मुंबई है ना, just I mean there's a nice market here. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Right. Yeah.
Why Delhi?
In fact, why Delhi? So largely when we went across and met a lot of consumers and early adopters, and we spoke to them, we saw Delhi as a market is the street side food, and they're very foodie, in terms of trying out things, and for that matter, soy chap, basically they are hot favorite of people in Delhi, and they're very familiar with these kind of products, and that is the reason why that market for us is going to be a driver to start with. And these people, they understand food, and they're in love with snacking. So once we get it right, then definitely we can take it to other metros and tier 1 cities. So that's the idea.
Yeah, thanks Somesh. Sorry to put you on the spot like that,
thanks.
but with all of the entrepreneurs are definitely looking at this, Peter, in terms of, and we are as well, in terms of getting people to think about this, talk about this, get them on side in some way, right? So Sangeeta, I'd love to talk about kind of your platform on Instagram and how you're thinking about some of this. Though of course, I recognize you might have a lot of questions and doubts, etc. I'd love to talk about them. But there are kind of many chefs that entrepreneurs are working with. So there are entrepreneurs working with Manu, for instance, out of Bangalore. There are entrepreneurs working with Gauri Devi Dayal out of Mumbai. I've also talked to Kurush about this. Kurush was your guest last week, right? Talked to Kurush about this a few times. So yeah, I think overall people are definitely reaching out and trying to do the right things. And each entrepreneur will, of course, the entrepreneurs will of course try to build out their own channels. Broadly, in terms of getting this stuff out into the market, there are a few different channels, right? So there is the direct to consumer stuff, Peter, that you said, right? Home convenience foods, where you can get it in a packaged form, and it might be ready to cook, or it might even be ready to eat, like heat and eat if it's pre-spiced or whatever. Then there's restaurants or food service. Then there's retail, and then so there's a lot of different things to build out, and all of the entrepreneurs are looking at their different channels and how they might build them out. Influencers and micro influencers, etc., are definitely part of the whole package of building that consumer brand as well.
All right. Sangeeta says she will make a post about this and tag us. So great, Sangeeta, that would be lovely. Praveen Kumar has a question about specific question about the third part of what we were talking about, the broad thing. How does single cell protein, algae, for instance, fare against plant-based meat? And Praveen, I presume by fare against, you're talking about taste and that kind of thing? Yeah.
It's hard to say. So single cell proteins fall under that third bucket of fermentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can use microorganisms in a number of different ways. You can grow, as I said earlier, you can just produce the microorganisms in large quantities, like fungi in very large quantities, and turn them into a meat substitute or whatever. Or you can coach the fungi to do what Praveen is describing, and that is essentially produce protein themselves. So there are companies globally. There's one called Perfect Day, which is making milk proteins from bacteria. So they've coached bacteria or microflora to basically become a cow and give you milk protein, which is really interesting, right? So the argument here is that because it's biologically identical to the milk protein that is in cow's milk, it should have some of the properties that can improve upon a plant-based formulation in terms of the taste, texture, creaminess, the mouthfeel, right? So I think that's interesting. But in terms of cost, there is a lot of room to grow there in terms of driving down the costs. And yes, Sangeeta, so I mean, algae definitely, especially on the seaweed side, algae is really interesting because they naturally express or naturally have certain components of flavor that go really well in seaweed, in seafood rather, plant-based seafood. So pretty much anyone who's looking at plant-based seafood, and yes, they're quite efficient to grow, etc. So anyone who's looking at plant-based seafood has some component of either flavors or even algae as a bulk ingredient into their product. And we've actually done a lot of work analyzing the algal protein value chain in India. And I'll just put this in the chat. It's kind of a technical paper, but maybe someone might be interested in this. Sorry, just give me a second.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. So Sangeeta or anyone who wants to click through to this, you can take a look. We've analyzed the value chain of microalgae and seaweed going into this. And this is, a great, as I said earlier, a great example of how we can bring farmers into the mix, create a new value chain, create supplemental income, etc.
Sorry, Praveen, you said what are the regulatory constraints to use heme? Blood products, hemoglobin, is that what you mean?
So it's a similar question from Praveen. So companies internationally are using the same type of technology I just mentioned, which by the way is called precision fermentation. It's a specific type of fermentation where you are coaching the microorganism to give you something and then you use that in an end product, right? So in his earlier question was single cell proteins from algae. And now he's asking about a specific type of protein called heme, or rather a specific type of compound called heme, which is used as a flavor component in products. Right. So like you said, Peter, heme it's in blood. It's the major non-protein component of blood. So it makes something taste meaty, bloody, as it were. So Impossible Foods, the Impossible Burger has heme that is produced from precision fermentation, which is, it creates a little bit of regulatory complexity in terms of being able to sell the product in the marketplace. So for instance, they are not yet available in Europe, right? And they're still getting into China. They would have similar challenges launching in India, just for that reason. So regulatory constraints, Praveen, are a very large topic that we can talk about for a long time. The FSSAI has just announced that they're willing to accept comments towards stuff like this. So that those comments are due on the 28th, so this week, basically. But given your questions are of a technical nature, I'm sure we would be glad to have these conversations with you and take them forward if you have interest on this side of things. So yeah, please email me any questions that you may have, and I'd love for our policy team to talk to you.
All right, I'll connect you, Praveen. No issues. I will share your ID with Varun, and you can get in touch.
Oh yeah, here, hang on, wait. I'm as long as you're fine with it, Peter. Here's my email ID.
Oh yeah, sure.
Please, everyone, any questions that you have, please get in touch. To the extent possible, I'll try to answer them and or connect you to the relevant team members. Somesh knows that my email is a bit of a disaster, but we will try to get you the answers that you need.
I mean, for all the fact that your email is out there publicly, I didn't want to add to that by asking that. But I mean, you respond very, very promptly to considering what you must be getting. But yeah. Varun, what I would also ask you to do, not now, but is perhaps send me a set of links, perhaps of further reading that people who are here, who they've, and by virtue of being here are interested, could possibly read up on, aside from GFI itself, which they do have the address of because I sent that out to everyone who subscribed. Anything else that you would like to share with them? And I think that would be nice. And, I think of this I think when I was growing up, which, I mean, Varun, Somesh, you're young men, but from way back when I was, a kid, there were these horrible soya chunks was about all you could have as a meat substitute. And it was like, it had all the taste and texture of sponge. But yeah, I tell people who are worry about change in our lifetimes that, again, both of you are young men, but while you were children, people still smoked in offices. It was completely okay, right? I remember in my agency, the agency I worked in, we moved to a new office, and a group of people in the office said, can we make this a no smoking office? And because you actually had no smoking offices as the exception. And our managing director, the founder of the agency, said, we handle cigarette brands. Give up the brands and we'll make this a no smoking office. And they said no, of course, because it was a huge amount of billing at that time. And the office continued to be a smoking office. But I remember visiting that agency around, I quit advertising in 2000 and started doing a number of things. At some point around 2005, somewhere, no, sorry, 2007, I dropped into the agency, which was, I hadn't been visiting for a very long time. And I met the national creative director outside the office, standing in the parking lot and smoking a cigarette because it was no longer respectable or thinkable to be smoking in office, to be smoking in a place where other people, so some of the stuff that we talked about in terms of what change in our lifetimes, what is thinkable, what is unthinkable, all of those things, and anybody who's trying for huge level social change, I think that the study of what happened with smoking, with this, there was science, there was policy, there was advocacy, and people talking about it, which sort of conspired to, in the course of about, in 7 or 8 years, that world completely changed on that. It would be unthinkable to have even a smoking office now. Regulations do not permit it, and a bunch of other things there. But I'm conscious also that I had promised you 2 hours, and we are at the 2 hour mark right now. But I do want to check with the audience if anyone else has questions that you would like to get in. We will talk for a little bit longer, as long as Varun is amenable, and Somesh. And in fact, if you guys have any questions for the audience as well, please feel free to ask them, and we will think. I mean, for instance, if you have a question for Sangeeta, who, as I said, has a following of some 50,000 people on Instagram, feel free to ask. She's got the microphone, so she can answer you. So Varun and Somesh, if you have questions for her, please do ask her.
Oh, but please
Yeah.
understand the following doesn't mean anything at
Ah,
all.
I did find your questions and your thoughts kind of definitely fascinating, Sangeeta. So could I ask your
Please.
point about aflatoxins?
Yes.
Um, so just a couple of thoughts here, and I'm not an expert on aflatoxins. So aflatoxin poisoning in large quantities does result in liver failure and death, etc. Right? So the primary danger from aflatoxin seems to be crop yields, etc., and like loss of food.
Storage as well. All kind of processing, storage,
Yeah,
especially in oil seeds also, grains,
got,
lentils, peanuts, nuts, otherwise as well. So
got it.
aflatoxins are created by some fungal mold contaminations, and not just liver problems, but a slow exposure for a long term can even be carcinogenic. Not just can, it is carcinogenic. Okay, so this is one of the things that people keep talking about. People ask me when I talk about cold pressed oils, etc., because refined oils are more sterile, and cold pressed are not sterile that way. And there, there is a possibility that those seeds are contaminated and could carry aflatoxins. And that's why I know that, and of course, I've been a botanist also, and aflatoxin has been something that I read as well. So, even small exposure over a long period of time can be really, really harmful for a lot of people. And in a country like India, where even in our homes we don't store our food very well,
Hmm.
it's a huge risk factor. So my point was like, since a lot of people just after this pandemic have got exposed to this idea of zoonotic disease. And this has become a very central focal point about all these conversations. So there's a similar risk factors and many more risk factors among plants as well. You know, and the other thing also I wanted to actually ask you, why not talk about plant-based food pairings that deliver better quality of proteins like a full spectrum of amino acids, etc., and human body is capable of making proteins for itself, right? And feeding the wrong kind of proteins is also detrimental for health. So those are also some serious conversations that we need to make in terms of uh, making human health more understandable and approachable for everyone, not just giving them a measured amount of protein of whatever kind. Poor quality protein is detrimental for health. We need to be talking about good quality protein with good essential amino acids. That's what I think should also be part of the conversation.
Sorry to hijack the screen, just to address your last point there. So Sangeeta, this is the kind of work that we do, right? So I mean, look, we don't tell people eat eat a legume and a grain and then you'll have all the essential amino acids that you need. Therefore, you'll have a complete protein meal or whatever. We work on next generation meat, egg, and dairy replacements, and our goal is to make them taste great, affordable, and nutritionally equivalent, if not better, right? And they will be better in some dimensions and they'll have some challenges in other dimensions. And by the way, this also addresses the other question, what are the challenges? But if you look at the sources of plants on the screen there, they are being evaluated across various dimensions, including what you're talking about, right, Sangeeta? So PDCAS scores, DIAS scores, etc. And what combinations, therefore, of different plants and ingredients offer the most, basically thread the needle of highest nutrition density, great taste, and which comes from functionality of the proteins, etc., from a technical standpoint. And if I were a credentialed food scientist and didn't just play one on TV, I might tell you stuff like protein dispersibility index, foaming, gelation, stability, emulsification. These are the things that these plants express in the end product, which gets you an egg substitute that is like, it has the properties of a scrambled egg or an omelet or a whatever, right? That's how. So this is the kind of work that we do. So Sangeeta, definitely on board with what you're saying. We have to think about those things, and in our specific context, we definitely do focus on that, because the idea is to deliver great nutrition also, for sure.
Definitely, thank you.
And on the aflatoxins point, yeah, look, I don't know to what, and you, again, you're the expert on this, much greater than I am. I don't know to what extent, like, we have solid numbers from an epidemiological standpoint on like what the aflatoxins constitute. I don't see this as an either or though, right? Like, I think we can focus on solving the problems that animal-based foods are currently creating. And by the way, there's data from 2019 that was just published a week ago, that shows that for 2019, which is the last data that we have available, the median number of estimated deaths from antimicrobial resistance already in 2019 is 1.27 million globally, median. So that's not the high range, that's the median estimated deaths, which is nearly as many as HIV and malaria combined globally. So these problems are already here in a big way, right? So that's antimicrobial resistance. There's also
that I agree totally, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
I want to take this question from Sabira and turn it around a little bit. She asks, how nutritious are these new proteins, especially for diabetics? And I would like to ask it in this way. India has per capita more diabetes patients than a lot of other countries. I mean, diabetes capital of the world, heart disease capital of the world, and so on and so forth. What are people in here, and I remember my dad gave up red meat because his cholesterol levels were a bit high. I gave up red meat I didn't give up red meat, I cut my red meat around the same time because I said genetics, therefore I'm probably likely to have the same kind of issue. And my red meat went down to like twice a year if I went to Bangalore and got a good steak, that kind of thing, otherwise no red meat and that kind of thing. But dealing with the kind of food requirements of people who live with chronic ailments, allergies, things like that. Is there interesting work happening? I mean, this is at a complete tangent to what we were talking about, but is there interesting work happening in those areas? Is this industry, community, whatever it is, are there people working on this as well, Varun?
Yes, so there are people working on evaluating the potential benefits of plant-based products, these next generation plant-based products for human health. So I'll give you two examples. There is a company called Quorn, which produces mycoprotein. And with mycoprotein, to Sangeeta's point, you have to monitor the growth and make sure that it doesn't have mycotoxins, etc. in it. But anyway, so with mycoprotein, they've done some research, essentially human level trials at the University of Exeter, Imperial College in the UK, and they've evaluated certain things. Now, again, I'm not a doctor or a clinical nutrition expert, and I'm not even interested in playing one on TV because that's such a fraught area. But I will say, here are the things that they've evaluated. Things like hyperaminoacidemia, hyperinsulinemia, which are things that can help you evaluate what impact those proteins have on muscle synthesis. And they've essentially found very close to equivalence with animal protein in terms of muscle building capacity in that particular study. They also, by the way, did actual muscle tissue biopsies, and this was done at various age groups and demographics. So like people who are young and relatively fit, with like the elderly as well. They did this. So they found, like, that dimension of muscle building and protein quality, etc., was good in that study. And they also did some stuff with diabetics, etc. And look, this isn't the secret. If you give people who are diabetic, if you switch their macronutrient profile of their diet, and you reduce the number of carbs, and you increase if you reduce the proportion of carbs and increase the proportion of protein, and make sure that it's overall high quality, etc., their blood markers will improve, right? This is also a reductive statement to make, because you also have to watch overall calorie levels and all of that stuff. But generally, if you change the macronutrient profile, the balance of people who are diabetic, and bias it more towards proteins than it has been before, if it was earlier carb heavy, their blood levels will improve, right? Their blood markers will improve. So that was also positive. And then lastly, Beyond Meat has a really interesting partnership now with Stanford Medical, which is really cool, where they've already done very small scale now, only a couple of hundred people thus far, but they're going to do much larger scale studies to show the impacts of the study is called Swap Meat. The only thing they have done is swap Beyond Burgers in and take beef burgers out. And they found huge improvements for people along all dimensions of cardiovascular health. So, and that makes sense. These things don't have cholesterol in them because they're made from plants, right? They don't have other components that come from animal meat like TMAO, etc., which we don't have to get into. Like I said, again, clinical nutrition is very complex. But I mean, again, this is a no-brainer in terms of, like, if you have cholesterol, Peter, and you want to eat mutton, eat the plant-based mutton. It's cholesterol free. So that's a huge option, right? Like whenever Somesh and his team come out with stuff, go like guilt-free, eat all the plant-based mutton that you want if you're craving mutton.
No, I mean, I sort of cut down all my consumption. So now when I don't have any of those chronic issues, because I sort of changed my food way of eating in a number of ways, starting in my 30s, and then made further radical changes in my 40s. So I don't have restrictions of that kind. I'm allowed to eat pretty much anything I want. And I think moderation was the key to, the key to all of that. Yeah. Yeah. Sangeeta remarks that cholesterol is made by our own body and not imported from food.
Sure, but I mean, Sangeeta, it's also unequivocally true that, like, you shouldn't be if you have certain issues with hypertension and cardiovascular issues, you should not be eating high cholesterol foods, right? I know it's made by the body, but also you should not be ingesting high cholesterol foods.
Okay, a question from Krishnan Venkateswaran again. Given that food here is being engineered, is there a case for long-term generational study on regular intake of this of these substitute meats before it is adopted for the mass market, because we as humans have had false starts like spam, margarine, vanaspati, and so on?
Yeah, look, good question. Again, honestly, clinical nutrition is extremely complex, and I'm not sure that I agree with the we have had conclusive results on spam and margarine and stuff like that. Like, people in Hong Kong eat spam all the time, and they have vastly better health outcomes to Indians in aggregate. Like, a lot of the stuff that we say is bad. There's like tremendous evidence that it's not from other cultures, right? Like, I just don't know that that's actually true what you're describing, but definitely we need much more evaluation of all of this in terms of human health. However, um, yeah, a lot of the stuff around processed, etc., is not actually true, right? I mean, the like in terms of just generally saying processed bad is not true, because everything is processed. We just don't think of it as processed. So for instance, and I'm not arguing in favor of like long ingredient labels and stuff like that, but a lot of the stuff that we say, like, okay, there's this one thing that has a long name on a processed food label, or an E number on a processed food label. So let's say stearic acid. Maybe it's added into something that you eat. I don't know if it is or isn't. But like, beef contains stearic acid. It's just not on the label, right? Like, you don't think of it as on the label. Or like the idea that, let's say plant-based beverages, let's say a plant-based milk is processed. I wouldn't argue that it's not processed. But cow's milk is processed. And, if you asked like, people who are in that industry, what is the process to get cow's milk? They would tell you, we milk the cow, but that's not true. What they do is they artificially inseminate a cow, and that there's a lot of mechanization that goes into it. There's like huge number of steps. So like, the process chart for plant-based milk cannot be extract the protein, do this, and the process chart for cow's milk is milk the cow. That cannot be the case. There's an entire chain there as well, right? So I would argue that it's just not true that we know that these things are bad for us per se. Like, I could show you great peer-reviewed, replicated studies, and in fact literature reviews, right? Like meta-analyses that show that tomatoes cause and prevent cancer. So like, I don't know. I just don't know that it makes sense to say some of this stuff.
I'm going to ask you one more, Varun. And how are you doing for time? Are you okay to go on for a little longer?
Yep, I'm good. Thank you.
Pratibha asks, what are the disadvantages at all from these products? And I'm going to ask that in a slightly different way, which is, I mean, you as someone who is like an advocate, someone who is an evangelizer of these things, and any good advocate, any good evangelizer knows how to play the devil's advocate as well, to ask the questions that are hard to answer for the people on your side. What are those hard questions which you're still finding answers for?
Well, yeah, I think the primary question is keep improving the damn taste and reducing the cost. Thank you, Sangeeta. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks. See you
Sangeeta,
soon.
thank you so much.
But yeah, so I think how long until we have like perfect taste at the price that we all need, etc. That's the primary question underpinning all of this. So I think that's still an open question that requires a ton of work. And again, renewables took 30 years. We don't have 30 years. There's a ton of work to do, and we have to really get moving across the value chain, supply chain, regulatory, government, talent, etc., etc. Additionally, I would say, even, can we hold these products to a very high bar for nutrition? So especially in India, I think we have this opportunity in India to, yes, the first generation can focus on matching taste, right? And focus on affordability, etc. But given that we have this major population that is undernourished, etc., can we get to every level of the socioeconomic pyramid and have these products or these foods be a fantastic vehicle for nourishment en masse? That, I think, is a difficult challenge. But frankly, a lot of stuff that we think of as like technological marvels or stuff that happened throughout history is because a group of people made a compact with each other to solve those problems, right? Like, when you aim huge resources at solving significant problems, you can solve those problems, right? Like the success of like being able to send a Mars rover by ISRO out into space, right, to Mars, um, for 450 crores. That didn't happen automatically, right? There was a mission mode that people went into and made it happen. So I think that's still an open question and a hard one for me to answer, because why hasn't it happened yet? Why don't we have a national mission for smart protein yet? And the only answer I can give right now is we are working on it, or watch this space, right? But I think we need a lot more people to come together to do that. And then I think one final thing is on the more edgy or like the futuristic categories of this cultivated meat, etc. Will they actually get to the cost that we all need them to get to, or will they be like a luxury product, kind of like Wagyu beef until time immemorial? Honestly, open question. At this point, that is a genuinely open question. Like, we've done a techno-economic analysis that shows that there is promise and we should continue working on it. It shows that by 2030, we can bring the cost down with huge support from government and World Bank and organizations like that. And by the way, what that boils down to in practice is we will create like, hundreds of facilities across the world that are each like $100 million in cost. And they've been extended financing that is equivalent to what like the electric vehicle gigafactories for the batteries have been extended financing to by governments and World Bank, etc., which is extremely lenient financing terms, right? So people have to come together and decide to do this, which is a difficult thing to make happen. In those very optimistic scenarios, we can get to like $6.50 per pound of cultivated meat, which is slightly more expensive than beef in the most expensive markets in the world. So to go from there to true mass market in places like India is another 5-10 years. So we're talking for cultivated meat to become a true mass market product in a place like India. In the best case scenario, we're talking 2035, right? So again, if we had been having this conversation about renewable energy 30 years ago, maybe we would have been encouraged to continue working on renewable energy based on the projections, right? But yeah, so that's an open question there in terms of how quickly can we actually get to some of these milestones in some of the edgier areas, the more moonshot or earth shot, we should call them, I guess, type areas.
Yeah. Sumesh, can I put you on the spot and ask you broadly what your price range is? And how does it compare to, say, meat that's available to retailers through retailers in Delhi?
Yeah. So Peter, currently, the entire space is looking at per se, if we start from a nugget, if it is a chicken nugget, a plant-based nugget, then largely it would be around 250 grams for around 295 to $300. That's the general pricing we are looking at. Again, in terms of pricing as compared to regular meat, we are around 60 rupees more than the regular stuff. And this is all going to come down, as Varun, you rightly said, Sorry?
60 rupees more per kilo?
Yeah,
right.
Currently. Yeah. So largely, if we are looking at, all the...
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Sorry. Could you compare? What about comparing with like the premium services like a Licious or a Meatigo or whatever? Because I think that is the initial clientele is more people who currently buy meat pre-processed from like a Licious or whatever, where it is more expensive, right? So how are we doing on those dimensions, like compared to that?
I guess, Varun, in those terms, we are just 20 to 30 rupees, higher than their products. And the margin is yeah. And see, we all know, India currently, we don't have high moisture extrusion happening, a lot of things are imported. So once we have everything happening in-house, everything start producing in India, then definitely we will achieve a great price point. And as you said, this is a work in progress category. We have just started. And, once we start producing and doing high moisture extrusion in India, a lot of our cost is going to come down. Yeah.
And You perhaps could take the question that Somesh, that Praveen had asked. What are the product level challenges that you're facing with that you had to conquer along the way, with a little bit of detail, perhaps on texture, flavor, taste, etc.
Yeah, so largely, to get the right texture and taste and sensory, we partnered with an MNC just to have that access to global R&D. So to have that kind of product in place, and of course, that was very difficult. We worked on it for almost 8 to 9 months to achieve the right kind of taste, texture, and sensory. And yeah, we are pretty much there. If we say, Varun, you have also recently tasted our product, so we are almost 90% there in terms of ticking the right boxes. So yeah, absolutely, maybe the larger challenges were to get the texture, because that's the most difficult thing. Once we have that, because with flavors and all going in, as the initial part of the conversation was going in, we Indians, we put a lot of masala and other stuff to spice up the product that acts like maskers. But largely, to get the texture, that is where the key is. And it took us multiple trials and errors to get to that right texture. Yeah, I hope I answered the question.
And it just struck me that also when you're solving problems like this about getting texture and the structure of flesh, that it would have applications even in other areas. Like for instance, repairing the human body. Things that loss of, say flesh because of a burn or an accident and stuff like that. And how would you grow human flesh, etc. But that also goes off into another little weird area, which would ultimately could possibly lend, go to look at synthetic cannibalism. I don't want to get into that one on this conversation. But Krishnan brings up, Venkateswaran brings up another interesting point. He says he's vegetarian and he's tried the both Impossible burgers, corn meat, Linda McCartney sausages and other burgers, and he took a double take on those. And he says that the vegetarian curious crowd, and it actually didn't occur to me. I was like, why would a vegetarian be interested? But I guess there would be a significant number of people who have never touched meat who would be curious about it. What's your experience of that, Varun and Samesh, of people who are vegetarian saying, okay, I'll consider this?
Yeah, I mean, so internet again, the best data is from international because they've scaled, right? Of the people who have eaten the Impossible Whopper, which is so Burger King has 720-ish 7,200-ish locations across North America, which is just wild if you think about it. 7,200 locations across North America. They launched the Impossible Whopper, which is the Impossible Burger branded as a Whopper, 100% Whopper, 0% beef. That's the branding. 90+% of consumers who are eating it are regular meat eaters, which means that the remaining, let's say, less than 10%, some of them are even occasional meat eaters. A very small proportion of them are vegetarians or vegans, right? And of course, India is vastly different. In terms of large number of people, I'm guessing of the roughly 400 million or so people who are like 100% veggie in India, very few proportionally would want to eat this stuff, because it's only if you are curious about the taste of meat or have a meat craving of some sort and you'd like to have a guilt-free option. That's what the sweet spot for this stuff is. I should say, by the way, just as an aside, there are really great other categories that are emerging that are outside of this whole smart protein landscape, that are really nice sort of center of plate veg protein foods that are not meat-like. So tempeh, I think tofu will get a lot bigger. Like I eat tofu and tempeh all the time. And there are some great brands that are coming up in that space as well. They're just not what we work on, obviously. So yeah, I think curious vegetarian is one of the archetypes that will do this, but it'll be a much smaller one than like guilty non-veg.
All right.
They would feel not to be left out from the category, Varun, maybe, but yeah, absolutely, they would be a very small percentage of that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Krishnan, because I had not thought of it in that way at all. Because as you know, as a, I don't know, is there a term for this? The person who eats meat and is a bit feeling a bit guilty about it. What would you call us? You know, I think I was thinking it from that perspective. So I never thought about.
So largely, Peter, food is a source of pleasure. It should not be a source of guilt. So that's what we drive.
Yeah. No, I mean, I had not thought of Krishnan's question, because I was like, why does someone who doesn't eat meat out of choice or upbringing, why would they want to eat something meat-like? And Krishnan has answered that question for me, and I hadn't thought of it. So thank you very much for saying that, Krishnan. But
Internationally, people have converged on the term flexitarian, which is basically people who regularly eat meat but are swapping it out for these alternatives, and they're flexible about it, right? So they have, there are some behavioral things that are common among them, which is that they recognize their impact on the planet. They recognize the consumption of meat, especially red meat, has a lot of impacts on their personal health. They might have seen the Game Changers documentary or whatever, right? So in India, we are using the term guilty non-veg. I think it plays really well because we do have this undercurrent of cultural guilt around meat eating anyways, right? So that's, I think, really important. I think it's a good point that Pratibha brought up just now as well about eating mock meat internationally for decades. But similarly to the soy nuggets or the soy chap in India or whatever, nobody would argue that those previous generation mock meats are satisfactory replacements for meat. Like in a place like Indonesia or in China, etc., mainland China, you might eat those mock meats on certain religious days, right? In the same way that you might eat soy chap during Shravan here in India. But we want to upgrade that. We want to give upgraded meat that's made from plants. Hopefully that'll take off. And in fact, just to give you an example, Ritesh and Janelia Deshmukh's company Imagine Meats was launched deliberately on Ganesh Chaturthi last year, October 14th, this past
yes,
year.
I remember that, and I said, oh, nice move.
Yeah, no, we planned that for a while, and the idea originally was to launch during Shravan, but it came and went, and there was some launch. I mean, with the pandemic and everything, there were some delays. But yeah, so like the whole deliberate, like Tuesday, Saturday, no guilt kind of stuff, I think is an angle that will play well in India. Like if you look at, for instance, companies like Behroo's Biryani, which does really, I mean, this is what I was saying earlier, right? Biryani is emerging as a hero category. During the month of Shravan, they have this interesting dichotomy where they actually sell a lot of jackfruit biryani. But those same people who are buying their jackfruit biryani tell them it is a poor substitute for meat. They're buying it only because it's Shravan and they're like, they need that biryani fix. But so that's the sweet spot, right? Like people who are feeling guilty, can and are really craving a superior alternative, basically.
Yeah. So yes, we're past 11:30, and I'm conscious that it's a working day for you, Varun, for you, Somesh. So I'm going to wind this down. But thank you, Somesh. And by the way, those of you who are still here, I in the private messages, I unpristed Somesh a little bit and said, give me a discount for my audience. And he said, yes, he's going to go and offer you folks a discount as he comes into your markets. So I'm, I'll write to all of you over here and see if Somesh has an offer that you can't refuse. But Somesh, thank you for stepping into the conversation, and good luck with your product.
Thank you, Peter, for having me.
Yeah, and Varun, thank you so much. This has been most generous of you to spare such a large chunk of your time on a weekend. And thank you for the vast amounts of stuff you've taught me today and you've given me to think about. Thank you so much. And folks in the audience, as ever, I see many of the people here who are regulars. Thank you for continuing to support Table Talk. And we'll be back in a fortnight. But for now, Varun, thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter. Lovely to be here. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thanks, Varun.